So what we're going to look at today is why delegation is so important in the first place. And that's what I use as a overarching term for everything from delegation of things to an employee, to a contractor, or to someone who is outsourced offshore or elsewhere in Australia. What you need to delegate or outsource will be looked at, as well as looking at the difference between employment, contracting, and outsourcing, and how to handle that workflow. And I've got lots of great examples of places where I've been involved in employment, delegation, outsourcing, contracting, all those different models, and how we've learnt lessons along the way with that as well. Now, first of all, I want to have a look at why delegating your work is so important. And I put it down to pure and utter mathematics. Adding people actually adds capacity in your business. Now, that may seem like adding people is just a case of turning on, turning on a tap that costs you more. But based on, say, if you've got an hourly rate of, let's make it $150 per hour part-time. So if you're looking at your hourly rate, how much is going to cost you to take part in that? Let's just say that you're taking on a contractor at $80 per hour over a year. You're automatically increasing your capacity quite exponentially. So initially what it does, it's like a 1-for-1. If you're taking on someone, just yourself, then if you're at $150 per hour yourself, then you are basically having to pay yourself at $150 an hour. But once you take someone else on, you're not paying them $150 an hour. You're actually bringing that back to the equivalent of maybe, it could be as low as $40 an hour, $50 an hour, even up to, let's just say $80 an hour as a part-time contractor over a year. As you can see in the green, it increases, which is their capacity. The capacity of your business increases well faster than the cost of adding on someone else. So when you add on that second person, you're not adding on someone at the same value as you. You're not adding on another $80 or $150 per hour. You're adding on someone at the rate at which they will be paid. Now, burnout is one of the biggest dangers we have. And according to the Queensland Department of Employment, Small Business and Training, 77% of small business owners will suffer some kind of burnout in their first few years. And that's simply because we take on all the work ourselves. We are it. In a lot of cases where we're sole traders, there is no other worker. There is only us to be taking that in. So you need to take on some degree of delegation, whether it's employment, contracting, or outsourcing, when you don't have the skills to do all the things that you need to do. Now, you may have started off your business in a certain way doing certain things, but eventually your clients, your customers will start asking you to do things that are beyond your particular skill set. Now, you have the option, of course, of denying that and saying, no, I'm not going to do any of that. But then you're leaving money on the table. You're actually leaving behind potential revenue that you could be taking on by having someone help you do that. Now, I'm not saying that the minute that somebody asks you to provide a particular service that you just do it straight away. What I'm saying is if you've got many of your customers that are asking you the same question over and over again, and you know that you cannot do that particular job or do that particular skill, and you may need to get someone else to help you out with it, then you know then that it's probably time to look at either you upskilling yourself, but that's only really putting a band-aid on the solution. It's not increasing the capacity of your business. So you have to then add people in. Now, the problem is though, there's only so many hours in your day. You've only got the capacity of 24 hours in your day. The reality is that's probably closer to 16 hours. And in amongst all that, you need to have some time to yourself, things like cooking dinner, looking after family, whatever it is that you need to do. So that's when you look at going, well, if there's only so many hours in the day for us to do all the work, who is going to be able to continue working for me beyond my own capacity? And this is where you start to add in additional people. Now, according to Business Australia, the customer dissatisfaction level is 24% higher with customers who deal with sole traders, freelancers, and micro businesses due to the work taking a lot longer than it normally would take with a larger business and an increased lack of ability to contact that business. Now, that business may be difficult to get hold of simply because you just cannot get to all those phone calls. as the owner of a few small businesses myself now, I know that this is a very, very hard thing to attract. It's a very, very hard thing to balance out. Is that the phone calls coming in? Um, there's the phone calls coming in need to be answered by somebody. Now, if you can't answer them straight away, we have voicemail, we have message bank, and that's great. That's a great beginning. But at some point, you need to return those calls. Those calls are taking time out of your 16 hours that you may have available to work with. If you're then taking that time out, you need to allow enough time in your day to include what we call reactive work. Now, the reactive work is all to do with the things that you don't expect that happen during the day. The phone call from a potential client, or it could be the complaint from a current client, or it could be a change of technology, or it could be some sort of emergency that pops up. So unless you're leaving some allowance in your day, 1 to 2 hours a day, to work on things reactively that come into you, then you're facing this customer satisfaction level being quite high. And the reason why it is so much higher in small businesses, sole traders, freelancers, and micro businesses is because we don't allow any additional time for reactive stuff in our day. We just say that our day is full and we book up right to the second to make the most amount of money that we can. And then we're not leaving any kind of capacity for any additional work that may come in that day. But that doesn't just include emergencies and reactive work. That includes new clients wanting to talk to you about the potential of becoming your client. So you're really preventing your business from growing or even continuing when you don't allow that extra capacity in your day. Now, the skills coverage matrix looks a little bit like this. The yellow orb is about what you're able to do, the skills you're able to do. The first person you add on is going to have some of the skills that you have and then some skills of their own. So what it means is that then you've got your skills and there's an overlap area where you both have the same skills, and then they've got these extra skills. When you add on those extra skills, that then allows you to expand into other products, other services, and other options. Let's say, for instance, that you are a website designer and you're designing websites, and the other person who you're taking on can also design websites, but they are also able to use Adobe Photoshop and Adobe InDesign to design graphics. So you've now not just got 2 web designers on staff, you've now got a graphic designer on staff. Then when you add the second person who has an overlap of some of your skills, they may know how to use WordPress, and they have an overlap of some of the second person's skills that they may know how to use Photoshop. Then they add in a new skill, which is social media management. So now your business has the capacity to build websites at an increased capacity than what it had before. But now with the additional increased capacity of number 1 and number 2, you can also start to offer graphic design services and social media management services. And you can see then that you don't have to necessarily start replicating your skill set in your 3rd, 4th, and 5th people. In fact, it makes sense to start replicating some of the skill sets of employees 1 and 2 into 3 and 4. And then once you get to 5, you've got a completely new set of skills that are way outside what you can do, but they are increasing the capacity of your business to add on even more types of skills and types of products and the kinds of services that you don't currently do. So when you need to delegate or outsource, when you really do need to look at the possibility that you have to make some changes in your business to allow for increased capacity, is when it's taking too long to do things, when you're struggling to keep up with the increased demand on your clients on what you do, and it's causing you some stress. It's making you having to work a 16-hour day instead of an 8-hour day. Or it could be that your customer dissatisfaction is starting to rise. You're starting to lose your clients. They're starting to go elsewhere. And this will always happen naturally anyway, because some clients are just never going to be pleased and never going to be happy. But you still need to have some sort of recognition that this is going to have. So it's going to be, a possibility that you really do need to consider that if you want to keep your current clients who require some sort of service, some kind of ongoing support, and if you want to grow into new clients, that you won't be able to do this on your own. It's also, you need to delegate or outsource when you can't compete unless you offer a broader product line. So I'll use that example that I used before, which was for the web designer. If you're a web designer and you are working with Wix websites, then all of a sudden you find that the market is really demanding WordPress website skills and you don't know how to use those, then you need to add on someone else or to contract someone else in a way that allows you to expand your service beyond just working with Wix to work with something like WordPress or Joomla or any other kind of platform that someone may need as a web designer. And let's take it out of the web design thing and maybe bring it into, if you are a social media manager and you're managing other people's social media accounts, you may not be able to compete with others if you're only offering, say, for instance, services in Instagram. If you don't know how to use the Facebook product or LinkedIn or some of the new products such as TikTok or Pinterest, then you may be losing out when you can't compete with others who are offering a much broader product line. They might come to you and say, oh, good, you're running my Facebook, but do you also do Pinterest? And you go, well, we don't really know how to do that. So no, we don't do Pinterest. The next minute they're leaving you to go to an agency or to a provider who does cover all the areas that they need. So that's some of the ideas of when you may need to delegate to other people through outsourcing or employing or through contracting. Now, there's some vast differences between the three of these. Employment is different to contracting, is different to outsourcing, although we sometimes, because of our own backgrounds, often as employees in the past, have taken on the idea that they're kind of all the same thing and they kind of all run in the same way, but they really don't. They're very, very different. So I want to start off first, before we go too deeply into this, to understand and whether you need to be able to yeah, what the pressures are that are going to come to play when you decide to follow one of these different paths. And there's a lot of ethical pressure that's put on you. There's some peer pressure that may be put on you by other business owners, family and friends who seem to think that you need to operate in a certain way. And there's definitely a guilt trip that comes when it comes to not employing people as full-time employees. So there's a lot of pressure, first of all, for you to become an employer. And becoming a full-time employer and taking on a full-time employee is seen as helping your country. It's seen as giving workers a fair go. It's seen as helping families, and you're helping people to feel safe and secure in their jobs. Now, I did not get into business to do any of those things myself. I wasn't thinking of my country. I wasn't thinking of workers. I certainly wasn't thinking of other people's families, and I wasn't seeking to help people feel safe and secure as the business plan that I was putting together for my business. The businesses that I've been putting together have all been all about making myself feel safe and secure. They might be helping my family, and they may be giving myself a fair go. But I never started a business, and I don't think anyone ever truly does start a business with it in mind that they're going to help their country and give workers a fair go. So there's a lot of pressure that comes from people saying that when you're not doing that, when you're taking on contractors, when you're taking on outsourcers, that you're somehow cheating Australia or you're cheating the worker. That's not my job. My job as a business owner is not to give the worker a fair go. My job as a business owner is not to somehow serve my country better. My job as a business owner is to make a profit so that I can live. And I'll use various tools in my toolkit in order to do that. That may involve full-time employment, and I have had full-time employees before. But that also may involve not employing anybody full-time. And increasingly, micro businesses and small businesses like those of ours who are on this call right now are not taking on that pressure of becoming a full-time employer. Now, there is sometimes some backlash over that, and there's certainly a backlash when it comes to contracting. You've got to understand with contracting, though, that there's a two-way street here. Whilst you don't want the commitment of having to pay superannuation and leave entitlements and all that, you've got to understand that you are not contracting a person, you are contracting a business, an ABN. So when you're contracting a business, you're contracting the capability of a whole business, not just the capability of one person. Now, in your conversations with the people you're contracting, that may be the case. That may be the plan. That might be what you're doing. Then that could be that you are, potentially, asking them to provide all the services by themselves, or you might be asking them to provide a suite of services that they will have for themselves and other contractors, maybe people that they've employed or that they're outsourcing. You are contracting their business's capability to deliver the service that you're contracting them to do. You're not contracting a person. That's very, very important to get that distinction. A person doesn't necessarily have the right of delegation. So if I go and work full-time as a full-time employee for a company, they have employed me, my capacity. I don't have the right then to say, I don't feel like doing that today. I'm going to outsource this to my Filipino outsourced call center, and they're going to do it instead. Your employer would say, that's not how things work, mate. We employed you, not them. But a business does have the right of delegation. So even though you may want to write into some sort of contract that they're only to use a certain person, the reality is that legally, when you contract a business to deliver something, even if that business is a sole trader, they do have the right of delegating that work that you've given them to someone else. Now, that may not sit right with you. It may not feel good, but it is a right they do have. Because remember, you're not contracting a person, you're contracting a business. It may be represented just by one person. It may only involve one person. And for all intents and purposes, most of the time, when you contract a single sole trader ABN business, you are getting just that person. But they still do have the right to delegate some of that work that you contracted them to do to someone else. Now, when it comes to outsourcing, there's a bit of a dirty stain that goes on. There's often the accusation that we are somehow taking advantage of people, contributing to their poverty, contributing to inequality in the world, that we're taking jobs away from Australians, but we're maybe only ever thinking of the money and not thinking about the impact of people. I kind of refer back to, and this seems like a really hardcore business-minded thing to say, I do have an ethic that I do not like to rip people off. For instance, if I employ someone who's 19 years old having their first job, they get paid a full adult rate. I don't pay junior rates. I pay full adult rates because I think that is disgusting that people can get away with paying someone a junior rate when they're doing the same work as somebody who is much older than them. But when it comes to outsourcing, you've got to understand international economics and currency rates and how things are different. You may think that paying $8 an hour to a virtual assistant in the Philippines feels like it's somehow ripping someone off and contributing to their poverty. But I can tell you now that that $8 buys a lot more than $8 buys here. It gets a lot further. It goes a lot further. In fact, paying to the level of, 10, 12, $13 an hour to somebody who's in a country like the Philippines is a very high paying job. So you've got to look at the difference. Not everybody in the world is working to the same standards, living to the same standards, or operating their business to the same standards that we are in Australia. Lying over our expectations of how people live is very, very different. Yes, you may be taking jobs away from Australians when companies like Telstra and Optus and the power companies take call centers in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, close them down and send them off to India and the Philippines. Yes, they are taking jobs away from Australians. Now, that then has a twofold effect. A company that has more on their bottom line to spend, invest that back into the company or invest it back into things like dividends to shareholders. And people often think that shareholders are these empty, meaningless things that are nobody at all. But the reality is that shareholders are not just institutions, they're also people who now have more return on their investment and more money to spend in the Australian economy. So there's a flow-on effect that happens even when these particular jobs are taken away from Australians, that then goes in to contribute back to the Australian economy. It's a very complex way. Not every action is going to have an equal and positive reaction in Australia. Sometimes outsourcing a certain amount of jobs from Australia to another place is really taking a job away from an Australian. There is also the fact that if you cannot afford to employ somebody at $40 or $50 an hour in Australia, you can afford to employ someone at $12 or $13 an hour in another country, you are therefore making more money within Australia that you can then spend within Australia. which goes into growing our economy and growing jobs. Now, outsourcing has not been the cause of most job losses in this country. It's been technology change, or it's been something like the pandemic, for instance, which had a very, very big effect on jobs. Now I've seen a bounce back, and I think we're at nearly about 90% of the job gain that we had prior to the pandemic. So we see that economies do bounce back and jobs do return. There's some things you just simply can't outsource, like service in a pub, retail assistants in supermarkets, people in offices in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, or like myself. I may be outsourced, but I'm not an offshore outsourcing. So not all outsourcing is done simply to save money. Some of it's quite simply because in places that are regional or remote, there's no possibility to find enough of those skills to get it done in that city. There's very few tech companies that are based in places like Townsville, Cairns, Darwin, and Broome, because those populations don't have the skill sets to be able to provide people on the ground with those jobs. And the last time I looked, most people in this country, in fact, something like 80% of them, I think it's like only 6% of the population lives above a line that you could draw across from, I think it was about Bundaberg to Geraldton in Western Australia. Only 6% of the population lives above that line, which means that not a lot of people are looking to make big moves for jobs to places like Darwin, Cairns, Longreach, Emerald, Port Hedland. People just generally in the south of the country are not looking to do that kind of lifestyle. So the only choice may be to either move yourself into those big cities that have some kind of access to that skill set, or you have to outsource or somehow contract to outside of your local area. Now, it may not be ideal. A business in Broome may be looked upon as bad because they haven't employed locals in Broome. But the last time I looked, there's not a lot of unemployment in Broome. There's not a lot of unemployment in my town of Darwin. And there's certainly not a lot of unemployment right now in Cairns or Townsville. So those jobs that apparently have been leaving the local community haven't really left at all because they didn't exist in the first place. The skills were not there. The employees and potential weren't there anyway. So there's a few advantages and disadvantages to each different model. When it comes to employment, the advantage is that you've got a more stable, long-term committed workforce. At least this is the experience that most larger companies would have, is an employment is something which you can count on more because the people who are being employed are generally looking for something more stable, something more reliable. They know that this amount is going to be in their account every week or every fortnight or every month. They've got their 4 or 6 weeks of annual leave every year, which they can count on. So they're not worried about whether, what the future is going to look like. Things become safe and very predictable. They can get home loans, car loans, credit cards. Everything is safe and predictable. Now, with a small business, that may not necessarily be the case. Stability is something which is only really afforded by larger companies and government organizations. Now, the town I live in Darwin, has a very large proportion of people who work for the Northern Territory and federal governments. That said, that every time that someone like me wants to employ someone full-time in my town, I am going up against the government, who pays much more than I do, has the much deeper pockets to pay for those skills, and will even relocate people from other places in Australia. I'm then left with the people who are willing to take something of a risk on a smaller company, or like the excitement of working with a smaller sole trader based business. That doesn't make those people more long-term and stable, though. Just employing people doesn't mean they can't leave, and they often do. In 1 year, I employed 12 full-time staff in the business that I was running, I was owning at the time. In that year, all 12 of those people had moved on to other jobs in other places. It got to the point where I could not find people to replace those roles in Darwin who had the skills, or at least the learning capacity to be able to pick up those skills. So I had to simply outsource it because those skills did not exist at the rate that I was able to pay. If I wanted to pay everybody $150,000 a year to do those roles, I would probably have some kind of advantage, but I just didn't. So that long-term stable committed workforce really is something that exists for bigger businesses, not so much for smaller sole trader based businesses. Now, contracting has a lower overall cost. Now, even though it's going to cost you more per hour to get that person to do the work, it is less complex, it's less admin for you, and it's a lot more flexible. So you can bring people in on a contracted basis for short periods of time, longer periods of time, or in on and off, and depending on what your projects might happen to be. So if you're running a project that's building a very large web application, then it might take you 6 months, but you don't need them for that whole 6 months. You need them for a burst of work for 6 weeks, and then you might need them at the end to implement for the last burst of work. So contracting lets you do that. Full-time employment, unfortunately, doesn't let you sort of lay people off for 2 weeks while there's no work, and then they come back and work longer when there is more work to do. You're stuck with those people and paying those people regardless of whether there's money coming in for you or not. Now, outsourcing is generally a much, much lower cost and is much more flexible. There's some setups with outsourcing that allow you to do things like you outsource to a business in another country, and that business then farms out the work. So they have the right to delegate, I guess is the word I was looking for, to delegate that work out to other businesses, other individuals, and people within their employment. So they might be employing someone, or they might be looking at delegating that out to others who have the skills to do it. The other model of outsourcing is when you outsource to an individual or their own little business on their own, working from their home or their own office, and they then will either do the work or likewise delegate that out to other people. So the outsourcing model isn't one model, it's various models that you can do. So you can outsource, say, to a development organization in India, and then that person is then able to be your project manager, who will then outsource that work either to people in India who can do that work for them, or they've already got a team that they work with. And in many cases, this is the case. They've got a long-term stable workforce of their own, of people who are more than capable of doing that work, that they can then get them to do that work all in-house, and it comes back to you through that one person you outsource things to do that work. Now, the disadvantages of all these are that full-time employment is expensive, it's complex, it's got legal requirements that come with it, and very large expectations. A full-time employee comes with the expectation that you're going to potentially give them a pay rise every year. They look for things like bonuses. They look for additional leave and time off. They expect that I guess that you are the servant of them, not them the servant of you. And a lot of modern employment strategies and modern businesses and corporations tend to foster this idea that the employee comes first, and then you look after the employee and they'll look after the business and look after the customers. Now, that can backfire on you, because sometimes getting rid of a poor employee is a very costly, very long-winded, and very complex situation, which is meaning that you need to often go through things like lawyers, litigation, mediation, human resources, and industrial relations law. It becomes a lot more harder to get rid of people when you employ them full time, especially if they are someone who is likely to fight back. Now, look, in most cases, you'll find if you want to get rid of someone who's an employee who's really bad, they'll just go quietly. But there is occasionally one who's going to rise up and they're going to cause you some troubles. With contracting, though, often contractors really only want short-term work, not long-term commitments. Because some people go, okay, they want some reliability in their lives, and they like to work on contracts of a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, even in some cases. And look, that's fine. But the contract doesn't mean you have to take them in for that long length of time. The contract is just usually given as open-ended. So you take them on as a contractor, but it's only for a guaranteed period of so much or to a certain value. So that you're contracting someone to the value of their time, not necessarily to a period of time chronologically. So for instance, you may say that I have a $30,000 contract that I wish to give to you to deliver these services within that budget of $30,000. So you would expect that that person would just work whatever hours it takes to deliver that within the $30,000. That's a bit different to contracting someone for their time. When you contract someone for their time, it's not for a particular project. You're contracting them for their skills, their experience, and their expertise on a per hour basis. So you're saying, I want to employ you for the equivalent of 38 hours per week on a contract, not on employment, but as a contractor to do that work, acting like a full-time employee, but not being a full-time employee, because they don't have any obligation necessarily to deliver that work themselves. They may deliver it through other partners, through other people who work for them, and through other people who may be, contracted by them to deliver some of that work. Outsourcing, though, can have a disadvantage of having massive communication barriers. And I think many Australian businesses have encountered this with dealing with offshore operations in places like India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, in the Emirates, although there's not a lot of it happening in the Emirates just now, but there is a lot happening in the Philippines. And one of the reasons why the Philippines has become such a center for Australians to use it is, number one, they're pretty close to our time zone. The Philippines is actually on the Western Australian time zone, so it's only really an hour and a half behind Darwin, and it's really only 2 hours behind the East Coast. So it's within a very easy kind of a time frame as what Australia is. So for instance, they were working 9 to 5 on the East Coast, then they're essentially working at 7:30, 7 to 3 in their time, which could be a very attractive thing to do. And they've got family commitments, community commitments, and kids. Now, there is a lack of control which comes about when it comes to outsourcing. And this is one of the major disadvantages, that you may feel very, very out of control. Unless you have someone in that country helping to take care of those things for you, it can be difficult to be able to trust what's going on with that particular person or with that particular team. And I've got a few stories coming up soon to show you some of the lessons I learned along the way in my own outsourcing journey. Another thing is that there's a wildly varying cost from person to person. You may get a quote for a certain amount for one person in one country, and then get another quote for another in another country. There is wild differences between the costs of this in India as there is in the Philippines. The Philippines is a much lower cost than what it is in India. Now, even though there's disadvantages to working with India, which generally are that there is a bigger time zone shift between Australia and India, but at the same time, that can be a bit of an advantage, because you could have people working right around the clock, not necessarily on Australian time. So if you've got customer service outsourcing to somewhere like India, then that could be really valuable to you, because they're covering the times when we're asleep, so that you have someone always answering your calls, always answering your emails, and they don't have to be based upon your time zone. That said, at the same time, though, it can be a massive difference when you have access to a large population of highly educated people. Now, this has been the advantage certainly of the Philippines. They've got a large population. They also have a lot of high education, where people are being educated well beyond what we may be in Australia for particular roles, but they are able to work at a rate much, much lower than the equivalent educated person within Australia. Now, this comes over to India as well, where the education standards are phenomenal, where you can have incredibly highly qualified and highly certified professionals in their field working for a much lower rate than what you would pay in Australia. So the equivalent would be that you were paying someone of that caliber in Australia for full-time employment would cost you about $120,000 a year. In India, that might cost the equivalent of around $50,000 to $60,000 a year. Although in the Philippines, that's more like $20,000 to $25,000 per year. So there's a very big cost differential between the Philippines and India. But there are other countries in between there. Vietnam has an increasingly big outsourced culture. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are both coming into their own as outsourced locations as well. And Pakistan is also a place that's actually really rising up in terms of its ability to provide really good quality English educated workforce. So those varying costs are largely due to where the person is located, but those varying costs can also be due to their lack of work experience, their lack of previous jobs, or quite simply the lack of skills. There's a big difference between someone paying $40 an hour in the Philippines and someone paying $8 an hour in the Philippines. And that's usually that they're not particularly great at that particular role just yet. So when do you employ? If you have ongoing stable work if your revenue is in a stable state. From month to month, you have great cash flow. From month to month, you've got a pipeline of new work and new customers coming through, and your business is booming, it's going well, then employment might be good for you. When you have very specific skills needs, so for example, if you need somebody who knows how to program in a certain programming language, if you have someone who needs to be able to speak in the language of medical equipment and medical supplies, when you have someone, the need for somebody who can type at a particular speed or has a combination of skills that you need, then they don't require a lot of extra training from you, then that's when employment might be really good. So you might be willing to bring on someone who has a multiple set of skills. They don't have one specific skill they're great at and everything else is poor. They have 3 or 4 particular skills that you want. That's when employment might be good. But likewise, it might be good if that person doesn't really matter who they are and what their skills are, but it's important they are trainable in what you need them to do, and you need them to do it right here. So let's say, for instance, you need to employ someone full-time in your restaurant to cook meals for you. Now, bring them on as a contractor just doesn't seem very safe when you've got to open a restaurant every day and bring people into that restaurant, and serve them food. You don't want to have the instability that comes with potential contracting. You need someone who is dedicated to coming in at those times to cook for your customers at that time and at that level every single day that you've employed them to do that. That's where someone needs specific training by you to do that job. That's when employment might be good. Or you might have a specific company culture. If you're a company who has a very, very individual way of doing things, for instance, you'll have people who might be serving a specific religious community. So if they're serving, say, for instance, born again Christians, they want to make sure that they have control over the language, the presentation, and the approach and ethics of a particular person working with them. And they feel that a contractor doesn't really understand that and doesn't buy into it. Or they are considering that it might be, someone outsourced in another country. They have no control over that. And that feels very, very important for them to have that level of control. Then local employment might be for that company. If you have an office, a shop, or a premises, a factory, or a manufacturing unit, you mostly like to have a full-time employee, because employees like to work at a workplace. Employees are not big fans of actually working from home. Now, it may seem like they are, but there's a very modern concept called work-life balance, which is all about leaving your work at work and leaving your home at home. So when you're at home, there's nothing to do with work. When you're at work, there's nothing to do with home. That kind of segregating your life into certain at-home personal or professional time is really popular. That's why most people have jobs and don't have businesses. They like to keep their work at a workplace, and then they come home and they don't have to think about that work or that workplace. Now, having someone in a workplace actually helps you to maintain quality control and to monitor the performance of your business and your staff. So if that's important to you, employment might be the answer for you. But if you're considering contracting, it might be where you need a particular short-term skill. So for instance, if you've got a project that's only for a short period of time and it needs a specific skill to be used over that short period of time, then having a short-term contract can be very helpful. In fact, pretty the only way you can get people in. You cannot hire people who have specific programming skills unless you've got the need for that programming skill every single day of the year moving forward. Contracting is also good when you're working on just a project rather than working on business as usual. So projects usually have what we call an end date. So it could be someone like building a house, for instance. Now, home building companies don't necessarily employ a lot of people. They're like a sales unit that then has a team that they contract the work out to, who fulfills the work for them. They have a team of contracted carpenters, contracted concreters, contracted roofers, contracted fit out people, and contracted kitchen builders. These people may not be at all related to each other, but they happen to work on these same projects. So if you've got projects like building houses, like doing physical work in, doing physical work in in a building or renovation or trades capacity, then that's where contracting is very good for you, because you don't have this work all the time. So you can't afford to be employing people in full-time work to be doing that for you. Another area where contracting makes sense is where it's too expensive to take on that skill over a long term. If you want to take on someone who is a stonemason to do work for you, but you only really, to have them at $280 per hour to work for you is not something you can take over a long period of time, because number one, you might not necessarily got the work all the time. And also it's just too expensive to take them on for the full time. Then you can take on a contractor to absorb that expense just for a short period of time. So you can get the work you need to get done and get them back out of there again. And also, contracting is good if you want to test someone out the first time. You might just go, look, I'm not ready to employ someone full time. I don't know how stable my business is going to be in this first year. So what I'll do is take on a contractor to work for me, and with their ABN, they invoice me for their work. And that way I'll know by about month, 3, 6, 9, or 12, whether this business actually is going to survive at this rate of paying someone. Then you go, yeah, you know what? It will survive. We've got cash flow. We've got good forward predictions of where our cash flow is coming from. Then yes, it's time to start consider employing someone instead of just simply having him on a contract. Where outsourcing comes is good is where a particular skill that you need is way too expensive in Australia. So for instance, if I needed a high level Node.js programmer, if I needed somebody who was a particular whiz at forensic accounting, and that skill here in Australia is going to cost me tens of thousands of dollars to get, but I can get it overseas on a short-term basis for about $250. Don't you think I'd be an idiot not to take the outsourcing? It makes sense where there's a short-term skill that needs fulfilling, and where you don't need it all the time. And to take it on, even for a short period of time in Australia, is far too expensive that you cannot find a way to find a customer who will pay enough to cover the cost of having someone in Australia do that work. Outsourcing good for when you need a workforce that needs to expand and contract according to the needs of your business. So we call this a variable workforce. So sometimes you might need certain skills. You need the skills of someone who can answer phones and reply to emails. But then that workforce doesn't become as important in, say, the shoulder season of after the dry season in the northern half of Australia, where, for instance, things get busy during winter but get slow during summer. You may need to have less people working for you during the summertime, but more people working during the wintertime. Outsourcing allows you to expand and contract the amount of people you have working for you and the amount of work that they're getting on a variable basis. Because they've got other people who they're working with, they're able to expand and contract that workforce in order to take on that work. It also means that those different skills that might be needed. So, for instance, today, I might need somebody who knows how to build WordPress websites, but tomorrow I might need someone who knows how to write social media plans. In that case, I'm using different people. So an outsourced arrangement may mean that I'm going through someone who has access to 30 different staff with 30 different sets of skills. Today, I'm using the person who knows how to build WordPress websites. Tomorrow, I'm using a person who knows how to build a plan for social media content over a period of time. It's also great for repetitive tasks. Things like accounting, bookkeeping are quite well done offshore. They don't necessarily need to understand the rules of Australian financial acuity, but they may need to understand just simply how to use Xero or MyOb or Reckon or QuickBooks or whatever the particular tool is you're using. So it's actually not popular to do repetitive work in Australia. People don't generally like to do repetitive work. I know, for instance, my bookkeeper, he doesn't particularly love doing the repetitive work. So what he's done, he's actually got it so I pay him a certain amount per month, and then he actually outsources the repetitive reconciliation work in my bookkeeping to be done by someone offshore. Very smart on his part. He gets to do the stuff that he really enjoys and that actually makes him more money. And the stuff where he doesn't make a lot of money on time, but it does require a lot of time to do, he outsources to someone else who can pay at a lower rate to do that. It makes great business sense. It's also when you need coverage after hours. I was talking before how having an Indian base of operations can be very, very advantageous because it operates at a different time zone to us. Likewise, you could have somebody in South America who is on a different time zone to us, completely covering those hours when people in Australia are asleep, but inquiries are coming through from all over the world. You don't necessarily need a 24-hour call center in Australia. You may need that overnight staff covered in places where it's not overnight, where you don't have to pay extra to have people staying up overnight to answer your calls. That can be a much, much less expensive means than setting up something here within Australia. In fact, the savings are up to about 80% of the cost of doing that here in Australia. So it's crazy to actually do overnight call centers right here. So I've got a few examples of how these models have worked for me in the past and how I've seen them in previous jobs and employment. For instance, when I used to work with Grant Broadcasters, who are the second largest radio station company in Australia, we knew it was time to outsource when the recruitment costs got too high for the particular skills that we were looking for. Now, we weren't looking for radio people. They're a very particular skill set, of course, and they're very easy to find because there's an oversupply of people in radio with the skills and an undersupply of jobs to put them in. So there was time for us to outsource when we actually got to the point where the recruitment costs of finding technical people for our digital division got too high. Then the cost per employee also got too high. It was actually too high for us to bring someone in regional areas where we demanded to have them, with those particular skill sets. And the tech skill sets often didn't even exist in any of the areas where we were able to employ people. We had regional managers demanding that people were employed in their markets. Then we had to make sure that we had tech skills in those markets, but the tech skills didn't exist and nobody with those tech skills wanted to move to those markets. There are also problems that we had where cultural fit was perhaps a bit of a problem. And we had no experience with offshoring before this. Nobody in the business had ever offshored anywhere. The outcome was that they needed a particular kind of cultural fit that wasn't going to come from people in other countries where English is not the first language. So they really did struggle with that. So they decided not to outsource to places like the Philippines, Vietnam, Bangladesh, or India, and decided to only do some outsourcing to the US. So even though that didn't actually get us much of a cost saving, it was satisfying those local markets to know that they were speaking with someone, or we were dealing with someone who culturally understood us and had a similar structure of business to what we did. That's then did not really save any money. It saved a little bit because we were contracting people in other countries, so we didn't have to pay them the inflated rates that Australians are paid in general, because we are probably the highest paid country in the world. We were actually paying a little bit less because to employ someone in Australia at $120,000 a year ends up being around about, you're not paying 120,000 US dollars a year. You're actually paying more close to about 70,000 US dollars a year for the same kind of person. So there's a very big difference between, say, the kind of wages you're paying and the kind of what the exchange rate will say. We generally are paid a lot more to do what we do in Australia, generally because our living standard is significantly higher than the average in the US. Now, we did do some onshore outsourcing and found some people in other markets that we were able to use their skills in other markets to fulfill what we couldn't get in those regional markets. Second one was my own business, Clickstarter. I knew it was time to hire locally. So this is an employment story. When I spent too much time on outsourcing, it was taking me too long to manage my outsourced staff. It was taking me too long I couldn't hand over my local client contact because people were getting really annoyed that they were dealing with someone who didn't understand them or know them or who couldn't talk to them in the right way. So the problems I had big costs, big superannuation complexity, and there was quite a lot of barriers to becoming an employer rather than a contractor. So what I did find that when I took on the first person, I took on someone who also helped to set up their own superannuation, all of the own employee stuff. So the first person was an admin person, and job number one for them was to be able to set up everything they needed to set up in order to be an employee and make it easier for us to take on employees in the end. So that guy became not just my first admin hire, but he became my project manager, and my HR person, who then helped me to go on and do the second, third, fourth, and fifth employee as well. So the first was always the hardest. I was very lucky that the first person I took on actually had a lot of knowledge of HR and a lot of knowledge of industrial relations and employment law. So it made it very easy for me to then to replicate that onto the next people. But it absolutely increased the capacity of my business by a long shot. Taking him on allowed me to sell more, get in front of people more, and spend more time on the tech. Then when we finally took on employees 3 and 4, then we weren't even looking at new people to take up, looking at me taking on tech. I stepped out of the tech and just really became the face of the company, the salesperson, so that I was doing what I needed to do, which was building the relationships and forming the new alliances. And the people in the back end, they were the people who actually did the work. So we got up to about 12 employees, as I said before, but all those employees, because I was in a remote market like Darwin, did come and go very, very quickly, or they went on to higher paying jobs that I couldn't really compete with, or they just simply moved on because they wanted to start businesses of their own. In the third case is a story of treaty business consulting, a place that I contract to now. And now it's time to hire contractors when we moved from having sort of repeated work that was very invariable. So it was the same kind of thing every month with the same kind of client, to moving to a lot of projects where there wasn't enough work to employ someone on an ongoing basis to do that work in-house. So we had to go, well, we need to get the work done, but we need to get it done on a project basis. So we found people both locally and interstate who were able to work in a way that was much more flexible and could give us some of their time rather than all of their time. Now, initially, there was a lot of training, a lot of culture fit to be getting people into our weekly WIP, or work in progress calls, so we could actually see, have everyone on the same page, thinking the same way, and acting in the same kind of combined force that we would have as a business. But that was something which, it was not compulsory for people to attend, but we did encourage them to attend once a week. The problem was also too that these contractors weren't available all the time, because sometimes they could be working on other projects. The outcome, though, was a significant increase to the skills and capacity of our workforce, and it allowed staff to then start to specialize into what they were great at and what they loved doing the most. So a few lessons we learned along the way were things like employers, we had the entitlement dilemma. When employees come into a business, they often are entitled. They feel like they need lots of sick leave, lots of family leave, and they make up kinds of leave. Like they make up things like personal leave, which doesn't actually exist. There's no legal definition of that. There's a lot of entitlement of I deserve a pay rise. I've been here for 2 months. And like, dude, you don't get a pay rise until you've been here a year. Things like contractors, we had what was called the timeshare consideration, which is that you're only really buying a share of their time, not all of it. So you've got to understand that sometimes the contractor could be working on other projects and their availability for you may be reduced. For outsourcing, there's a bit of a loss of control that we found when we worked with the Philippines, where we actually worked with someone who then sort of would disappear for 2 weeks at a time. What would happen is that family circumstances would change at some point, where we'd have someone going, I wasn't able to work, but they don't communicate that with you because they feel embarrassed about it. There's a cultural shame associated with not being able to fulfill what they're meant to be doing. And that's all like a source of shame, but then they still expect to come back and still work for you after apologizing. So a lot of that can be avoided by simply spreading your losses across an organization in the Philippines that could be doing this, rather than just outsourcing to an individual person. I would never outsource to an individual in the Philippines again. I would only ever use a team, and I'll use that team that's managed usually with management here in Australia. You'll pay about $5 to $10 per hour more for that person. But when you're talking the difference between $8 and $18 an hour, you're still not paying $40 an hour like you'll pay in Australia. So it's a lot cheaper, and ultimately you'll get a better outcome from it. So some of the tools you'll need before you delegate are things like customer relationship management tools and project management tools. So things like Trello, Google Calendar at the lower end. So when you get really big, you might start to use something like Monday.com or Salesforce to handle the flow of work coming into your business and then flowing out to your contractors. At the beginning, though, I really thoroughly recommend you use something like Google Calendar to mark the times when things are due, and then Trello as a system that allows you to move tasks from to do to doing and then through to done, so that you can see and your whole team can see where particular projects are at. But there are lots of tools that will help you to do that. You don't have to use that particular one. If you're looking to employ people, I really do suggest you get in touch with Business Australia. You can become a free member and get access to tools and templates, and even phone lines you can call when you can ask people to ask people about how to employ people in Australia and what the laws that you may need to be aware of are. You can also do that through the local chambers of commerce in Queensland, WA, and in the Northern Territory as well. When it comes to outsourcing, there's a number of places you can go. Fiverr is probably the biggest one at the moment. Airtask, Upwork is huge at the moment for hiring people to do different things, particularly technical things and repetitive tasks that can be done on computers. Freelancer is another one. And if you want to go through a kind of an agency that will help you manage your relationship with your outsourced worker, then onlinejobs.ph is quite a good, powerful tool as well. I've had some good results through them. Fiverr's had some sort of off results on different projects. Upwork's been okay, but I definitely think that going through a team when it comes to working, particularly with the Philippines, is the best way to go. And understand too that when you're working with staff in the Philippines, when you're working with a team that works in a center, you'll pay a little bit more, but they're far more reliable. When you're working with someone who's working solo from home, you'll get all sorts of problems, because it's not like in Australia where we often have, I've got 2 spare rooms in my house at the moment. So I can work from home in spare dedicated areas, which I don't have to be disturbed in. I just do my work. In the Philippines, that kind of situation doesn't really exist. You don't have spare rooms. Large families live in small places. So the work often has to be done from cafes, from kitchen tables where there's kids running around. They don't have a lot of focus. So just understand that going through an agency or a team is going to give you a much, much better outcome in the end. I'd like to thank you for joining me today. You can get hold of me at that email address on screen, dante@treaty.com.au. You can reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn or Facebook. Even if you'd just like to ask for some advice on what my experience was with outsourcing or what my experience has been with employment, or if you'd just like to be pointed in the right direction of people who you can talk to, either through the ASBAS Digital Solutions Program, or maybe even people in your particular state or territory that can give you some really good advice on how to work with employment, contracting, and outsourcing as well. Thank you so much again. I hope you have a fantastic week. In the meantime, thank you for taking some time out of your business to work on your business.